Hello, and welcome to another Ouchies Batrep. Today, I get my feet wet trying out Axis and Allies War at Sea. Check it out. Since I love how they got the crazy carrier design market completely locked up, I went ahead and chose the Japanese for my first outing. I have no idea what I'm doing, so I tried to pick something with an air dominant strategy that perhaps was a little historical. My opponent is a apparent veteran of the game, and he was able to teach me all the rules to the game in fairly quick order, and I do believe he went for the same route, only with a slightly more balanced list in retrospect. The game is played with 3 objectives worth, I think, 25 points each, and we were playing to 150 points? Don't hold me to that. You can either sink the other enemy fleet or you can claim the objectives. And wouldn't you know it, when I went to record this, it cut off a little bit on the top, and we're going to miss a little bit of the action out there. But my strategy is pretty straightforward. Since I got 2 battleships, I will go ahead and split the fleet out into 2 separate sections, a northern task force and a southern task force, and I hope that my opponent is going to be able to bleed off his task force so that hopefully at least the Kongo or the Yamato is engaging cruisers on their own, and just make do with the Iowa and just send all kinds of bombers at it if I can. The learning curve on the game isn't too steep, but it certainly is there as I make a few fairly critical missteps early on, sinking my bombers after what I think are valuable targets on the other end of the map. Namely, I'm going after their carriers to hopefully free up a little bit of my fighter assets in the long term, but it left a couple of my carriers and other fleet assets on my side of the board almost undefended. I also did not take into consideration that he has a lot more fighters on the board than I do, or at least a lot more units that can double as fighters. My Kates and Vals can't double as a fighter like his Helldivers, I do believe, can. Actually, the Helldivers can't, but they are pretty crazy bombers in the attack. They get 11 dice, and as you'll find later on, that's almost what the Yamato does in his secondary guns. They are terrifying fighters on the offense. Surprisingly though, my Emily and Betty bombers have been sortering from their land bases, and they didn't die immediately. I was kind of figuring they would just kind of burst into flames historically, but they actually managed to harass the destroyers and other flotillas that aren't getting all the allied support that they can, as my opponent didn't do much to defend them. But I am paying for this miscalculation as the Shoho almost begins the game crippled, while the Tone also manages to take a couple bombs. It's not looking good for the Japanese as I'm rolling onto the field crippled from the start. The Yamato, meanwhile, spearheads the southern edge while the Shoho sits back, nursing her wounds. At this point, she's pretty damaged, and she's almost just a gambit to pull bombers off of more worthwhile targets so that I can sick fighters on her. There's an advantage to keeping the fighters around the carrier, because then you can always move them around after you've deployed them. It's pretty neat. It's worth looking into the rules, because the rules are actually pretty fun. Simplistic, but not simple. The Yamato begins opening fire against the Iowa, and the Iowa trades shots back. Meanwhile, the Tone begins taking all kinds of bomber fire from the Enterprise, I do believe, and my fighters are spread really thin. I only have 3 stands to work with, and it sinks as a result. There's nothing I can do to stop it. It's a sad day for Japanese command. The Oi opens up her guns on, I do believe it is a Lafferty class in front of her, and she does not survive the round. Meanwhile, the Yamato opens up her guns, ranges in on the Iowa, delivers successive hits, and completely destroys the Iowa in one successful volley. Oh, it's a horrible day for U.S. Command. She's able to return fire against the Yamato, but it's not enough to do so much more than ding the paint just a little bit. Meanwhile, the Yamato has guns to spare, so she starts plugging destroyers and cruisers that happens to be in range, to not much effect. Fighter cover has become increasingly thin, with most of the Japanese carrier-based bombers having bit the big one in the sky by now, but the American carrier planes have all lived to this point. It's really being pulled through by the Japanese land-based bombers, which have surprisingly not burst into flames. it's amazing how much damage they're actually doing. They're harrying, they're shadowing, they're calling out the formations, and just generally giving the Allies a really hard time. But it's not going to last for much longer. My opponent has started singling out the Emily's specifically just to get rid of them, and he knows that my fighter cover just can't protect them all the time. So it's becoming a American fighter versus really horrible bomber duel, but I've got a lot of them. They were kind of cheap, so they're all over the board, just kind of making a mess of everything. And if that wasn't thinning out his forces enough, having lost the Iowa in such a dramatic fashion, now the Yamato's taking on the Atlanta and a destroyer on their own. It's being left to a submarine sitting out there with the Ui to try to make things a little bit more fair, but it's not a good trade in any historical concept, or even in this game. Meanwhile, on the northern end of the match, the Kongo is actually engaging in a similar engagement between the cruisers and destroyers on the northern end, but the Yamato makes much better work of it, sinking the San Francisco in one volley and clearing off the rest of her escorts. The submarine out there doesn't take it very lightly and turns its guns over to the Ui, sinking her as well, leaving the poor Yamato out there with just its destroyer flotilla to protect her, in addition to the swarm of fighters I have protecting her up above. But the Kongo manages to make do on her side and sinks the Atlanta. There's actually not much surface action going on anymore, leaving the poor carrier fleet almost without any kind of protection for the poor Americans. But they still do have nearly their entire fighter and fighter bomber complement and the subs to protect her. The Yamato, however, is out for blood in an attempt to sink the ship that has been harrying her with fighters ever since the beginning of the game. She's going deck gun to deck gun against the Enterprise, which, you know, the Enterprise had, I think, 3-inch guns, but the Yamato has 18, and at this range, 1 square away, that's almost point blank, so the Enterprise seeks all her fighters. The entire American contingent has started to be thrown at the Yamato in one last desperate attempt to silence that thundering monster of the seas. And she starts shaking them off. It actually doesn't do much damage to her. Meanwhile, on the southern end of the map, I left a destroyer flotilla to deal with the American submarines, and they do pretty well. And their day's about to get a whole lot worse as I sick way more than necessary amount of Emily bombers out there to do some anti-submarine warfare against them. The Yamato opens up her guns against the Enterprise, but surprisingly enough, she lives through the exchange. Not by much, though. As a matter of fact, I realize in retrospect I forgot all the secondaries and tertiary guns that the Yamato had that could have opened up the Enterprise like Swiss cheese, but alas, what can you do? She lived through it, and I felt bad for shooting at it, but he didn't feel bad about shooting at the Kongo as a lone sub manages to sink the crippled battleship. The Yamato goes into point-blank range with the Enterprise. Again, it's kind of the only move the Enterprise can do at this point, as it's starting to look very grim for the American contingent as they seek more and more fighters against the Yamato, hoping to be able to cripple or at least damage it in some meaningful way. But it's not going to be very good as the Yamato is opening up at point-blank range against the Enterprise. Again, 3-inch guns versus 18-inch guns, and at this range, it is a whole lot of dice the Yamato is going to be rolling in this next phase. Meanwhile, on the northern end of the match, without the Kongo being able to take the objective, it leaves more or less the Intrepid to take the objective on her own. I'm not content with that, so I sick the Akagi after her. I can't send any of the escort carriers because they're actually very thinly armored. But the Akagi has some pretty good guns, and so does the Yamato as the Enterprise sinks. I actually feel kind of bad about this. I mean, I'm sinking an American icon. But nonetheless, it is a horrific victory for the Japanese. And on the northern end, the Akagi starts going gun to gun with the Intrepid and manages to deal just the same kind of damage despite the brouhaha that's occurring over top. And with that, the Japanese wins. I'm not sure how this happened. I'm sure it's a fluke in the rules. And that's been Ouchies Batrep. Thanks for watching.